Hello, everyone. Welcome here today. This is part 2 of a session on addressing challenges and possibilities within religious communities when religious beliefs conflict with human rights. I want to thank Sikh Dharma International for bringing us here together today. In the spirit of the first Sikh Guru, Guru Nanak, he taught love beyond boundaries. So this interfaith panel will address issues of discrimination, injustice, inequality, inequity, and exclusion within our respective religious communities and belief systems. Guru Nanak was a profound poet, a phenomenal musician, and a mystic humanitarian who lived in the 15th century. His vision of Ik Onkar proclaimed that we are all interconnected as one within the creative force that enlivens us all. And as Sikhs, it is our sovereign duty to protect the dignity and ethical treatment of all life across gender, sexuality, caste, race, religion, and environments. Yet today we see the toxic effects of colonization, racism, casteism, heteropatriarchy, and self-serving individualism within our religious leadership, spaces, communities, and homes. Due to the exclusion and harm being experienced in these spaces, there are now worldwide Sikh movements calling for a theological return to the egalitarian teachings of Guru Nanak, to stop female infanticide, with Me Too Sikh working to make Sikh spaces safe from sexual misconduct and assault, LGBTQ plus Sikhs calling for marriage equality, Sikhs awakening to the need to address racism, colorism, and casteism in our families and communities, and urgent cries to connect with our deep spiritual wisdom. So I welcome each speaker here today to share 1 or 2 prominent challenges you are experiencing in your faith community in areas where religious or community beliefs conflict with human rights, such as the rights I had delineated: women's equality, LGBTQIA rights, issues of systemic racism and casteism. Panelists will focus on what they are doing to address these issues and how we might work together to bring creative solutions to our faith traditions and communities. I'm going to share their bios now, and then I will invite them to speak. Dr. Jagbir Jhutti-Johal is senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham. Her teaching and research focuses on Sikh theology, interfaith dialogue, gender inequality, Sikh identity in the diasporic community, racialization and mistaken identity, and other contested issues that confront the Sikh community nationally and globally. Her work in the Edward Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion looks at public policy, social and political engagement issues as they affect and are affected by the British Sikh community. Mother Tracy Wells Miller received her Master of Theological Studies in World Religions and Interfaith Dialogue from Harvard Divinity School, and Master of Divinity from the School of Theology at SANI, the University of the South. Her passions in ministry are working with lay people to discern their gifts and how God is calling them to use those gifts in the world, standing in solidarity with marginalized communities, people experiencing homelessness, LGBTQ people, racial and ethnic minorities, and bringing people together across divides, particularly through interfaith dialogue. Third to speak will be Rabbi Sarah Hronsky. Thank you for being here today. She's a senior rabbi for Temple Beth Hillel. She earned 2 master's degrees at Hebrew Union College on Jewish Institute of Religion, at the Jewish Institute of Religion, 1 in Hebrew letters and the other in Jewish communal service. A major focus of her rabbinic studies was the Jewish tradition's view of persons with disabilities. A major focus of her rabbinic studies was, Rabbi Sarah helps build bridges through interfaith activities, such as partnering in educational and religious experiences with Muslims for progressive values, and serving in a leadership role on the Council of the Los Angeles Council of Religious Leaders. And we also have here Reverend John Edward Cager III. Thank you so much for joining us today. He is senior pastor at Ward African Methodist Episcopal Church in Los Angeles. He became ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1994. Politically active, Reverend Cager worked for Tom Hayden's campaign, California, and was elected as a delegate to the 1984 Democratic National Convention. He was named in 2007 Pastor of the Year by the Inland Valley News. Reverend Cager presently serves as the interim president of the Los Angeles Council of Churches and is the president of the AME Ministerial Alliance of Southern California. Thank you all for being here today. And I will just repose the question that we will be covering. What is the most prominent human rights issue you are addressing in your scholarship or within your religious community? What are our challenges, possibilities, and responsibilities in addressing this issue? Dr. Jagbirji, I offer for you to speak first. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirinjan. So I'm going to focus on the issue of homosexuality and conversion therapy, for example, within the Sikh community, but also then focus on LGBT rights in terms of same-sex marriages, but also how, as a community, we are seeing a new movement of social activism on these issues by a young generation of Sikhs. So, a Sikh is not merely a student or disciple, but rather a continuous learner of the teachings of the Guru Granth Sahib, embodying the scriptural values. As an authority-defined scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib became the only eternal spiritual teacher which has guided Sikhs worldwide. The Guru Granth Sahib begins with the number Ek, 1, symbolizing one creator or the oneness of God, which became an important hallmark of equality of humanity. In its fair approach, disregarding social standing, requiring the non-discrimination, as Nirinjan mentioned, on the basis of caste, creed, class, religion, and gender, and upholding social justice that guarantees equal rights and opportunities for all. And we're finally worshipping the unique creator. It is a guide to the ideal Sikh way of life that emphasizes selfless action performed in the best interests of the society and promotes family life and social commitment. For both men and women, Sikhi has emphasized the active role of the individual in marriage and family life. Practicing family life is essential for society's development. Therefore, Sikhs practice heterosexuality, a gendered institution based on a gendered relationship, social and personal relations between women and men. Sikhi focuses on a relationship between the husband and wife and between parents and their children. These roles are governed by biological explanations. Now, to preserve that heteropatriarchy, two cultural values are very important: family honor, izzat, and shame, sharam. These two concepts regulate the conduct of members of the Sikh community. What then about non-heterosexual identities, those who are lesbian, gay, or trans? Sikhi has no specific teachings, in my understanding, of homosexuality. There is no mention of homosexuality in the Guru Granth Sahib, and this has created ambivalent interpretations of the Sikh position concerning homosexuality. Now, the majority of Sikhs believe that because the Guru Granth Sahib is the complete guide to life, and because Sikhi emphasizes the complementarity and unity of the two sexes with distinguishable gender roles associated with either one, and since there is no mention of homosexuality, then it is against God's will and against natural law, especially since institution of marriage is essential for procreation. The discussion also focuses on how this attraction can be controlled if the 5 vices are controlled: Kaam, lust, Krodh, anger, Lobh, greed, more emotional attachment, and Hankar, ego. Lust is the one that needs to be controlled with reference to homosexuality. The belief that it endangers the moral well-being of Sikh society means that it is discouraged and actively forbidden and should be prevented. It is this that also prevents the discussion of same-sex marriages within the Sikh community before the Guru Granth Sahib. Now, there are pressures on men to behave as masculine and at times hyper-masculine within the Sikh Punjabi community. It is because of these expectations and notions of honor and shame that we have seen LGBT Sikhs hide their identity and live heterosexual lives, or families trying to correct their children's sexuality through religious and cultural interventions, otherwise known as conversion therapy, which may not be equivalent to what is prevalent in the Christian community, for example, but there are similarities. One, share in the common view, a false view and unethical assumption that being LGBT is a condition that requires curing, or that it is a psychological disorder. Or two, it is an aim to change a person's sexual orientation or suppress their gender identity. On conversion therapy, there is, within the Sikh community, very little or none empirical research into the experiences of Sikh gay men or lesbian women. Now, conversion therapy in South Asian community includes talk therapies, especially for faith-based providers. Conversion therapy often involves teachings pulled from the religious texts, prayers, and spiritual discipline. I have heard through my work with certain organizations, but also through my research, of families taking young people to religious priests for guidance and, for example, prayers to change. And I've also heard how they have forced young people to marry, aimed at changing the individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. For example, that could mean attempting to change someone's sexual orientation from lesbian or gay. These all create harms, and at a social level, religious and cultural homophobia and conversion therapy results in physical and mental harm. The disclosure of one's gay identity in these circles can lead to, and does lead to, ostracization and otherization. Thus, the belonging principle is often vulnerable to threat among Sikh gay men and women who have not yet disclosed their sexual orientation. And coming out itself can essentially result in actual threats to belonging, particularly through family disownment. And we need to, as a community, address this before we can even address how we make sure that these members of our community are safe and respected. I think within that notion of our requirement to protect, what is clear is that contested issues, especially those that infringe on freedom of religion and belief, and as a result of practice or your sexuality, need to be addressed. One of the fundamental teachings within Sikhi focuses on the divine light, the Jhot, which resides in all of us. So with respect to that Jhot, we should respect and value all human beings and not cause harm. That is our instruction. However, through what I've just mentioned, we can see that harm is acted out. So what I focus on and what I am seeing within the younger generation is particularly an activism, a social activism that is rising. And it's important to note that a culture of protest and activism is embedded within Sikhi. And modern day Sikhs draw on their religion's history of protest against persecution and standing up to injustice to address the issue. And for me, there are some key players who are doing this. Within the UK, we have individuals like a young gentleman called Laxman, and he's the UK founder of an organization, a Sikh by birth, of a founder of an organization called Gay Asians, a community-led national LGBTQ+ organization, which is built to increase visibility of the UK's South Asian queer community. That's a unique thing, and it's a bold thing to do, to put your head above the parapet and try and raise the discussion. There is another organization that comes to mind, which is Sarbat, which is a volunteer-led group addressing LGBT issues from a Sikh perspective, who empower members to encourage discussions, to tackle homophobia and transphobia and build bridges within and beyond their communities. And another gentleman that really does stand out is Sukhdeep Singh. And he is an individual who stood for the rights of gay people in India by setting up Gaylaxy, an online magazine, at 22 years old. He started a queer collective on Instagram in 2019, and he wore a rainbow turban to the Sri Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple in Amritsar. The roots and passing down of stories in families from Sikh history, as well as the use of social media to spread campaign messages, are important in nurturing a conversation so that we can address inequality and oppression. And it's essential that we have conversations like today and have research done by the community itself, but also by academics, so that we can see change take place within our community, which is imperative if everyone's human rights are protected, so that they as humans can all flourish within this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jagbir Jhutti-Johal. That was a really wonderful summary of the situation that we're experiencing right now in the Sikh community, and the call for young people as activists pulling upon the Sikh tradition of equality for all and this need to protect those who are being harmed. I really appreciate you sharing this important perspective today. I now invite Mother Tracy to speak with us on these important topics.
Thank you, Nirinjan. It is such an honor to be with you all today on this panel. I feel like I'm standing among giants, and I am so grateful to be with you. I am a priest in the Episcopal Church, and I serve a congregation in Santa Cruz County in California. And in our church, many of you who are not Episcopalian or Christian may know of us in the United States through our media coverage for activism in various progressive social issues. But what I want you to know about the Episcopal Church is that we are, and we have always been, what we call a wide tent. So the Anglican tradition coming out of the Church of England has always been a place in which common worship is more important than common belief. So that we do have a variety of perspectives theologically within our church, and it has caused conflict at times. Because some of our progressive stances are not shared by some of our members. So it has been something that has been difficult in our tradition to think about how we maintain everyone being welcome and present at the table, including those whose beliefs are viewed as exclusionary to others. How do those people also feel welcome and feel like their church is a place where they can be safe in expressing their opinions? And in the Episcopal Church, again, one of the things we're sort of known for is being one of the first Christian churches to have openly gay and lesbian people in leadership positions. Although I would say the United Church of Christ was probably way before us on that. But we got a lot of attention in 2003 when Gene Robinson was elected Bishop of New Hampshire as the first openly gay bishop in our church. And I happened to join the Episcopal Church in 2003, not knowing that that had just happened, but really walked into the church and learned about that and said, well, thank God, as a millennial, thank God some church is taking, a stance on this. And so for me, it brought me into the church and made me want to stay. And when I hear some folks in the older generation lamenting how many people we lost because we took that stance, I remind them that people like me and my peers and those younger than me, many of them joined the Episcopal Church because of that. And they talk a lot in the Episcopal Church about how do we engage young people? And I said, this is one of the ways that you have done that, because many people that I meet who come into the Episcopal Church come in because we have taken the stance on gay and lesbian issues. So I just want to speak to, I think this particular issue in the Sikh tradition is very interesting to me to see this arising. I remember when I was working at the Pluralism Project at Harvard about 20 years ago, I was really interested in researching what different religious communities were doing and responding to around the issues of gay rights. And I was sort of said, don't go there, don't even ask those questions to people because they're not ready to even have that conversation yet. And that was really surprising to me, but it's really encouraging to see these conversations happening, in their own time and not by way of the white Christian people forcing them on people in the interfaith community. So I just want to say that from an Episcopal Church perspective, I think one of our main issues right now is the issue of racism. I feel like we've done a lot of great work on LGBTQ issues, and that's been done better in some places than others. So in some churches, they really had some intentional conversations about human sexuality, about marriage, and what does that mean theologically, and really delved into that. Whereas in other places, it was sort of just said, well, this is what the convention has decided. And so now if you think that's wrong, you're just horrible and you're not a good Christian, you know, and it was sort of like oppressively put on other people. So there, it was handled different ways in different contexts. And I think the best of that is something that has helped us to learn that, you know, imposing change never works, really, that you have to have conversations that allow people to share stories and open up to one another and see one another's humanity, that great teaching of Guru Nanak, that, you know, our humanity is one beneath all of these labels that we put on ourselves. So currently in the Episcopal Church, we are in the midst of somewhat, I would say, of a racial reckoning that was really sparked after George Floyd's death last summer. And the summer of 2020, there were, obviously, as you all know, many protests and demonstrations and things that came up. And one of the things that came out of our church was a letter that was issued by 3 women priests of color, 2 African-American and 1 Indian-American, called Speaking of Freedom. And they issued it on July 4th weekend. The 3 authors are Kelly Brown Douglas, Stephanie Spellers, and Winnie Varghese. And they issued a very powerful letter that said, you know, basically the Episcopal Church talks a good game, but what is the reality of who we are as the Episcopal Church and the way in which our church has been the church of power, the church of empire, the church of oppression, and how can we dismantle that? How can we really claim that as who we are now? So I just wanted to share a brief passage from that letter. They write that, let's see here. We have promised as a church and as individual followers of Jesus to resist evil, and when we fail, for we surely will, to repent and return to our God. In this moment, we must do the institutional and personal work of transformative truth-telling and repentance. Learning from the witness of our South African and Canadian siblings, we can organize diocesan and local truth convenings that feature public storytelling and confession of the racial violence and oppression in which Episcopal churches have been complicit. As truths come to light, we can commit to change structures, behaviors, and practices that participate even unconsciously in white supremacy. And I think that's really important because a lot of people in the Episcopal Church think of themselves as, oh, I'm not racist. I'm a progressive white person who, you know, wants to work for racial change, but they don't realize the ways in which they're unconsciously perpetuating those structures. And so they end the letter by saying, can a denomination steeped in white supremacy turn and dedicate its life to dismantling the very structures of death that it blessed and built? Can it become beloved community where the flourishing of every person in all creation is the hope of each, where the oppressed are liberated from oppression and oppressors are at last free of the sin that oppresses? And we believe that with God's help, the Episcopal Church can become an instrument, not of oppression, but of God's peace. It can grow followers of Jesus who are more concerned about taking up the cross of our crucified Lord than they are about maintaining the control and privilege of a crucifying culture. And I just want to say that for me, that is the gospel of Jesus. And it pains me to see how the gospel of Jesus has been used throughout human history to oppress, to crucify others, because the whole message, in my understanding, is that of liberation, of lifting up people, of letting the oppressed go free, all of that biblical stuff that we, unfortunately, as human beings, have to keep getting put through our thick skulls by many different prophets, because we just keep going back to our sort of innate animalistic tendencies in a sense. So for me, like, I joined the Episcopal Church because I saw in it that movement of being a beloved community. The first Episcopal Church I was a part of was a racially diverse congregation that I intentionally joined because it was racially diverse. And it's something that we have a lot of work to do, but we are moving in that direction. There's currently a curriculum called the Sacred Ground Circle that's being held throughout the Episcopal Church. It is written by a white woman in the Episcopal Church who did a documentary film called Traces of the Trade, in which she discovered that her family had been one of the largest slave owning families in New England. And she traced her family's history back, and they actually went and visited the places in Africa where they had bought and sold slaves. And some of the descendants of the slaves and the descendants of her family went together on this trip. And she made this film about it about 20 years ago. And now she's been involved in creating this curriculum that's really designed to help white people do white soul work on racism. And, you know, it brings in the voices of people of color, but doesn't expect them to, you know, speak to us or answer all the questions, but making us really look hard at ourselves and what we and how we've gotten to where we are. And in 2009, our General Convention did officially repudiate the doctrine of discovery, which, of course, historically has oppressed Indigenous peoples. And we are working to remedy, you know, some of that history as well. But I think that's really our challenge at the current moment. And one last thing I will say, and I'm sorry I'm going on too long, but Rabbi Sarah was saying, you know, you give people who speak for a living a platform and you got to shut them up. But one thing I wanted to share is that there's a film right now on Amazon Prime. It's called My Name is Paulie Murray. And Paulie Murray was one of the first women priests in the Episcopal Church, and also an African-American woman. Later on, and struggled with gender identity, people have come to refer to her as transgender, that she was probably a transgender man, but there wasn't really language for that in her time. So she is an amazing figure. There's a documentary about her life or their life. They're starting to use the they pronoun. And I just would encourage you to check that out. And I think transgender issues are one way in which the Episcopal Church has still work to do. We've done a lot with gay and lesbian, but gender identity is something that we haven't done as much work in understanding, and is becoming more understood. So thank you for your time and listening. And I look forward to conversing with the other panelists and hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Mother Tracy. You raised so many important points as we look to do this work of thinking about white supremacy, Christian supremacy, exclusion in communities, the notions around or experiences that people have around oppression, and to really engage in conversations with one another rather than just only trying to impose change, which causes others to feel excluded as well. So how do we make change together moving forward? And I think that idea of conversation, of building the beloved community through holding one another as beloved, is such an important central tenet. So thank you so much for sharing this perspective. Rabbi Sarah, I would invite you to speak now.
You bet. I love that you just use the words beloved community. Pastor Cager has brought me into many discussions about beloved community. And by bringing us together, you are holding that very tightly. We know that we're taught, at least in our faith tradition, that God created each human being, B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image. And we're taught that God created that first human being, male and female, God created them. Every person comes from that entity, that first Adam, in my tradition and faith, which means that every person is exactly equal one to the other, and not just equal, deserving of respect and deserving of the same kind of gifts and awe that we might offer to God. Sacred, each person is sacred. Now, interestingly enough, we know this at the very core. It's the beginning of the teachings for all Jewishly identified individuals, and yet, just as there are different ways to exhibit faith and understand your faith system, different folks who identify as Jewish will follow this tenet in a variety of ways. For me, as you heard, I happened to do my thesis on the views of individuals with disabilities across our texts. They were stigmatized and they were othered for so very, very long. Now there's a whole different embrace across tradition line of individuals with disabilities, and not assumed simply to be the sinner, the rejected, the put to the edge of society. In my personal approach to Judaism, I identify as a Reformed Jew. This is a very progressive and action-oriented genre of Judaism, if you will. We're taught from the Union of Reform Judaism that the great contribution of Reform Judaism is that it has enabled the Jewish people to introduce innovation while preserving tradition, to embrace diversity while asserting commonality, to affirm beliefs without rejecting those who doubt, and to bring faith to sacred texts without sacrificing critical scholarship. We are going to embrace individuality alongside of commonality, and we are going to preserve tradition while adapting and reforming. So if you hear any Jew tell you, I'm a reformed Jew, it is not past, it is ongoing. We adapt and we look at our law and our heritage and bring it forward through this time. As a Reformed Jew, we also have a social action arm of justice called the Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C. We teach our families and our community to stand up and to call for change. Through the Religious Action Center, we have been taking a mighty stand across time. I will say that the Reform Judaism took its first stance on LGBTQ plus rights in 1977 with 2 resolutions, and there have been dozens and dozens since then. We ordained our first female rabbi 50 years ago. 50 years ago, we ordained our first female. Sorry, Pastor Kager, that you are the only gentleman on this panel, as I believe that equal participation does matter. But part of my Jewish belief system allows for women to stand side by side along males in leadership roles. We, as a movement, have ordained one of the first openly identified transgender rabbis in 2010. We have been working on all sorts of human rights action through jail reform, looking at how we treat refugees, demanding change to how we treat refugees, looking on how we treat the immigrant and how we harbor and provide safety. This is very common within my wing of Judaism to advocate for, stand up and see the rights of those as important, whether they identify in a similar way as I do or they identify in their own belief system. In terms of as a synagogue rabbi, I serve a lovely community. We have had 2 big hats on, even throughout the pandemic, that have been standing forward. So I say jail reform and refugees and immigration, and that's something I've been teaching on. I took a group of teens to Washington, D.C., and they lobbied on these issues. They lobbied on gun reforms. They lobbied on the rights of reproductive rights for women. So we constantly are pursuing, but the 2 big issues within my congregation this past year have really been obviously in this world of racial justice that Mother Tracy was speaking towards. We brought in Professor Dr. Mark Dallinger to challenge the Jewish concept, even amongst progressive Jews, that we stood by our brothers and sisters in civil rights. And so we are exempt, or we've already done our part. Actually, we needed to own the part that we caused, the part that we are holding in systemic racism, and the very part that, yes, we may have marched side by side, but we also were part of establishing, and we continue to be a part of establishing this caste system in America. And so we have to make changes. And so we brought in folks that will ask us and push us and make us dig deeper into this work. We engage as a community in studying books and really having deep dialogue and being able to identify where we are racist. And it's very hard for individuals who think that they are so progressed and so informed to be accountable. And they have been in our community. We also brought forward a discussion about what it means to be a Jew of color. We've discussed what it means to be identified along that large spectrum. And are you really embraced in a synagogue or not? Guest speakers, those from within our synagogue sharing their story. And of course, I'm super grateful to Pastor Kager for all of the hard work that we do together to bridge our communities in dialogue and to continue to lift up the voice of one another in understanding and building bridges. The other area that I will say, which is going to be very hard, but I also see the time. One of the areas we don't talk about enough, and I think it's super, super important. The country of Israel is a human rights advocate. She's a tiny, 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 tiny piece of land amongst many that do not allow for voting rights for those within their boundaries, that don't lift up LGBTQ, that don't lift up women, that don't treat others fairly. And so we do need to lift up Israel in that stead and call out that she is a democracy and a human rights advocate. However, she is not perfect, just like America is not perfect. And the one area that I don't think it's talked about enough, that is something we have to confront, is the fact that Israel is also occupying for 50 years. And so if we don't allow that discussion to come to the table, we are losing our moral compass. And that is a problem. We can call out the positive attributes of Israel. We can sing her praises for standing tall amongst many who do not treat others well. At the same time, our moral compass is telling us that we are obligated to discuss occupation, to confront occupation, and that 50 years is simply too long. That, as a Jew, has to come to the table, or we are missing a vital element. And this will be very hard for many in my community to hear, any criticism of Israel. And while it's not necessarily criticism, for me, it's simply a statement that we have to do better. We can hide behind legalese, but we also need to have that discussion. And when it comes to human rights, occupation is a significant issue. So I know the time is very brief. And so I'm going to turn that floor over to Pastor Cager. So maybe we'll have a discussion, but if not, Pastor Cager will bring it home.
Well, thank you so much. You raised so important points, and this idea of reform being ongoing and ever changing, and continually reckoning with whether or not we're living to and upholding our values that our religious belief systems teach us. The idea that we can hold these polarities, the idea that we may see as polarities, such as innovation and tradition, we can hold them together and respect them both, is such an important point as we move forward together. So thank you so much for everything that you shared. And Pastor Cager, we look forward to you, as Rabbi Sarah said, bringing it home for us. Thank you.
Well, very quickly, yes and amen and ditto to all of the issues that have been raised. My denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, was formed out of the oppression of slavery in America. Members of the Methodist Episcopal Church were rude and disrespectful to Africans and slaves in their congregation in Philadelphia, at which point the founders of our denomination left and formed their own to escape oppression. But the issue we face in the 21st century is we as African Methodists, as well as many Black denominations, have become oppressors. Genderism, the LGBTQ issue, even racism within our communities are issues. I do not think there is a bigger moral challenge facing the AME Church and the Black Church like the issue of marriage equality. In my denomination in specific, and in the Black church in general, we have had a long-standing don't ask, don't tell policy with respect to the LGBT community. We have always used the creative energy of artistic people who may be LGBTQ. The running joke is that the choir director is gay, the lead singers are lesbian. I have a good friend who's an Episcopalian, Tracy, who says that it is impossible for a straight man to be able to play the pipe organ. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's his statement. And the church has, particularly the Black church, has embraced the creativity and the energy and the positive aspects that are brought to worship by the LGBTQ community, while denouncing their state of grace. We label them as sinners, but we love to use their talents. Even and I'll share with you, Tracy, that I do have a cousin who's an Episcopalian priest. And I think in many Christian denominations, there has been this duality. They tell our clergy who are LGBTQ, well, you know, if you're gay, just find a lesbian to marry and you guys can put on this facade, but in front of the people, you will live a heteronormative a life, because that is what the Bible portrays. Now, in all of our denominations, we send people to get very expensive seminary educations, where we discover that many of the tropes regarding heteronormativism are not really backed up by good scholarship. However, because we have traditionally pushed that binary male-female model of marriage as normal, we continue to hold it up, even though we know intellectually that may not be the norm for everyone, nor is it required by the Creator. But, and I suspect I'm the oldest one on this panel at 58. For my generation, we have been beaten and pressured into accepting those realities. However, our younger generations, particularly young generations of clergy, don't want to be closeted anymore. They don't want to live this facade. They want LGBTQ people to be able to live their truth in a worship space, because if you can't live your truth in front of God, you have no truth. And those who are in clergy, they don't want to minister from a place of inauthenticity. And so just this past July, we had our general conference. AMEs from 6 continents around the world, several thousand of us, got together in Orlando, Florida, to vote to remove our ban on clergy performing same-sex marriages. It was not quite World War II, but it was probably close to the American Civil War, as we had the entrenched old guard, people in my age group and older, who the Bible says man shall not lie with a man as he lies with shall not lie with a woman as he lies with a man. And we had other people like, you just made me spend $200,000 on a doctorate degree that tells me something different. And we have young people leaving in droves because they dislike our inauthenticity and our hypocrisy. Long story short, we did not remove the ban on same-sex marriages being performed by our clergy. However, we did, and this was a sea change for us, we did establish a public commission to examine the issue of our stance on marriage equality. It was a weak move, considering we were formed out of oppression, and we oppress those who we should be trying to bless. However, it is more movement that we made in the past 4 years than we made in the previous 60. And so our denomination, like our parent organization, we came out of the United Methodist Church, which is facing schism right now, splitting in part over this issue. Our denomination will probably be at the same place if we don't acknowledge and embrace the wholeness of the LGBTQ community. On other issues, genderism, racism, we're running out of time, but we do have to acknowledge that in our denomination, we have existed on the generosity of women. Women fund our church. We have existed on the human power of women. Women do 80% of the work, the teaching of the children, the putting together of the conferences, the preserving of the institutions. We have lived on the kindness of women in our denominations, and yet we still limit their opportunities professionally as clergy. We still limit their voices when we make official statements, and we still place them in second-class status. As Rabbi will acknowledge, when God made woman as the Ezer Kenegdo, it was a push against, not a push under. And so we in the Black church have to acknowledge the wholeness and the equality, if not superiority, of women in clergy and in lay leadership.
So powerful. Thank you all so much. Yes, amen. I see the chats just lighting up with just appreciation and valuing all of these points that have been raised today. People sharing their personal experiences within our worship spaces, and this idea that people want to live their truths in their places of worship, and that they can't live that. And if they can't do it in front of God within their spaces, where can they do this? So, and that ministers don't want to represent or minister from a place of inauthenticity. So hearing the struggle that the African American Methodist Church has been, Episcopal Church has been experiencing is so profound for this particular moment. I see that our time is up, but I want to take a few moments if anybody wants to speak with one another or hear any concluding thoughts before we end today.
Can I just jump in? I think for me, each speaker powerfully kind of showed the activism and how much energy it takes to have these difficult conversations. But it also, with reference to how, with your reference to the generosity of women and speaking up for women just now, Reverend Kager, just kind of showed how male allyship really does give women that strength and hope to carry on forward. And your words were powerful, particularly for me as a woman, trying to address the issue of LGBT concerns within my own community is hard. As a woman, trying to tell men who are gatekeepers that they need to consider and rethink certain things is difficult. And to know that there are other men from other religious groups and everything who are supporting women and recognize the value of women in all these important discussions is heartwarming. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes, I second that. Indeed. Very encouraging. Yes, Mother Tracy.
I just wanted to make a comment about, I don't know, there's some things in the chat and then some things that I also shared about my tradition being a wide tent and how to make room for people who are having difficulty with paradigm shifts of, the thing that I struggle with personally, and I'll just share this, is that, people who are in positions of power, who, historically have been white men in most places, when they aren't comfortable with something, their uncomfortability can prevent other people from flourishing. And so that is difficult for me, because I think any of us, when we have privilege in any way, shape, or form, whether it's white privilege or the privilege of being an academic or whatever it is, like, we want to be a space where everyone can share their truth and speak what they feel and not feel silenced and all of that. But anytime we're holding privilege, I think we also have to remember that it's complicated, because our privilege can actually silence and harm other people. If a church leader says, I'm not comfortable with doing same-sex marriages, they're preventing someone from marrying the love of their life because they aren't comfortable with it. And so, there's a dynamic here, and I think that's where you get into the rights issue. I'm not necessarily totally comfortable with the dichotomy between religious beliefs and human rights, because I think religious beliefs are totally supportive of human rights if we interpret them correctly. And I also think it's not just about rights. It's about, that's a kind of secular language. I think it's about what we're called to do as followers of God. And that ultimately it's not, there's not a conflict here, but unfortunately we see it that way in so many cases. But that, there's this real struggle between how do we both make space for the difficult conversation and not prevent the continued oppression of the people who are being oppressed. And it's like, so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there and say, it's really complicated. And I just want to call all of us to examine our privilege in whatever ways we might have it, even if we don't think we have privilege, to sort of remember the ways in which our lack of movement on something. It's easy for me as a cisgendered person to just not talk about transgender issues, right? I can just go on about my life and it doesn't affect me. But if I don't talk about it, like what Dr. Jagbir was saying, you know, if we don't have men advocating for women, if we don't have cisgender people advocating for transgender people, then, you know, what are we doing anymore? Like that's letting go of our call as religious people, is to stand up for the brokenhearted and those who have been oppressed. And instead we're sitting there just going, well, it's easier. I have the luxury of not having to say anything, where someone who walks through the world as a transgender person of color, they don't have the luxury of not getting reaction to that every time they open their mouth and walk into a space. And if those of us who don't have to deal with that don't speak to that, then, you know, we're being complicit in it. So anyway, thank you.
So Mother Tracy, I would just say that you don't have the luxury, which is what you just expressed, right? You expressed that it is our right to interpret our religious values correctly and bring them to the forefront. And so, yes, you could stay in white privilege, but you are saying as religious leader, you actually don't have the luxury to sit there, that you have to take an action. And I very much appreciate that you said that. I wanted to add one small glue, if you will, is that one church, one mosque, one preacher, one reverend, one rabbi, one Sikh, one Buddhist, they don't represent the entirety of that faith system. And so when we build bridges, one person to another, we may open a door. And so when one faith leader closes the door in the face of a transgender individual, when one faith leader closes the door or slams the door in the face of someone who looks different than them, we have to remember that somebody else may open that door, and that person we may connect to or bring others to. And we have all brought these bridges one to the other today. And there are individuals who will put human rights and the core of the religious faith system before the extremist and before those windows and doors slam shut. So thank you all for sharing in this dialogue with me today, because it's allowing me to see further, brighter, and more hope.
Thank you all so much. I too am filled with hope through this conversation, and the point about it not necessarily being about human rights as being a secular issue, and it's really about the what we're called to do through our own faith as our responsibility to care and show up for one another, and even when we're uncomfortable about it, to be present with those feelings within ourselves, and reach out to try to learn and listen from one another. So this fact of dialogue, of conversation, which we're all able to have here, and that's happening in the chat, I think is so powerful as we continue to move forward. Because as Pastor Kajer also said, it's our youth they're wanting a new way of being in the world, and they're calling for it. And if we can't get on board, then either we're being left behind or they are. So how do we care for all of our, generational, diverse, multifaceted communities? So I really appreciate this conversation that we've had today. I thank you all for being here, and I thank you everyone in the audience for staying with us a little extra today. I think we'll close the session now so that you may get to your next session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.